Train cars derailing in East Palestine, Ohio. Toxic chemicals spilling out all over the ground, contaminating the soil. Water supply for at least a week threatened, and possibly long into the future, because the rare forms of liver and lung cancer that are associated with the chemical vinyl chloride may not show their head for decades. A disaster, a man-made disaster of epic proportions, but not alone. Every time you look up, you can see other man-made failures of infrastructure in the United States. When President Trump visited East Palestine, Ohio this week, he quickly segued in a question to talking about Pete Buttigieg and our nation's airports, talking about the transportation secretary and his oversight of something that you may well have experienced over the past 12 to 18 months. Increase in flight delays. It seems every time we turn around, there's less we can rely on our nation's infrastructure. Revolver, a great website, had an article up this week entitled, "What Happened to Hardworking Men?" In it, it's entitled, "America Lost Hardworking Men Who Held Her Together, and Now She's Crumbling." In it, he has a chart that shows major U.S. power outages over the last 21 years. It distinguishes major power outages between weather-related and non-weather-related power outages. So those that seem to be induced by acts of God and those that are induced by acts of man. In the past 18 months, well, since 2021, the man-made U.S. power outages take a leap on this chart put out by Climate Central. Most people who have tracked the rise in power outages over the last 20 years are those who keep up with, quote-unquote, climate change. And they attribute almost all of those power outages to climate change. But what we see here in this chart is the same type of failure that leads to airport delays, the same type of failure that leads to train derailments, and that is a loss in literal manpower. What happened to men? What happened to America? What happened to Atlas? In Ayn Rand's famous book, Atlas Shrugged, she describes a society arriving at the moment of failure where successful, hardworking men have been vilified as robber barons, as capitalistic thieves. And these men and women, these titans of industry, go on effective strike. They simply disappear into the night. They all end up living somewhere in Colorado, a place called, in the novel, Galt's Gulch. But as these innovators, as these engines of society disappear, slowly America begins to fall apart. Not unlike what's happening today. We're talking about trains not running on time. We're talking about electrical grids failing. We're talking about every industry that relies on the hardworking man slowly becoming something that does not work. I've used the word man several times, and in many of these applications, it can be a proxy for mankind. But it is also often men, literally men. Men, over, I think, the last half of century, have become, well, a shell of their former self. They have become like those toys we played with when we were kids, perfectly sculpted, muscles and body, with no real functional strength, no real core, no real center, no real soul, and no real purpose. There was a fascinating article up this week called The Longhouse. It's about an internet meme that I don't really know much about, but it's the idea that much of what's happened in American society is the product of 50 plus years of establishing appropriate behavioral norms by feminine standards. That starting in, say, the 1960s with the rise of feminism, there was a vilification of masculinity. It's as though when feminism rose, masculinity had to fall. Thus gives rise to the idea of toxic masculinity. You know, naked ambition is vilified. Open conflict, open competition, frowned upon. In this article, it talks about most HR departments and a lot of upper middle management in corporate America is now inhabited by women. And along with the civil rights movement, HR departments adopted a civil rights view of appropriate behavior within work. What that means is always paying attention to someone's feelings, re-gearing human interaction in the workplace and then broadly out into culture and society towards sensitivity. In this article, they quote Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is a thinker, I believe, from the left, who's been a guest on podcasts like Joe Rogan or Bari Weiss. Jonathan Haidt said, though, this is like squeezing a balloon. You don't suppress the human desire to compete, but when you suppress masculinity, all you've done is squeeze the balloon of competition into a more feminine standard, less confrontational, less direct, but still competitive. If you think a lot about corporate environment, it is geared that way. And look, that's not to say all women, connive behind the back and all men bravely stare into your face. But there are behavioral standards which have been established. And along with the rise of feminism, I think it's fair to say we have witnessed, I think we can all agree, we have witnessed a decline for 50 years in masculinity. And men today sit in a place where there was an article out this week, a new study out showing that in their 20s and early 30s, men live lives single and unplugged more than women who have significant others, boyfriends, are dating, married. You're looking at men who have been hollowed out, who are plugged in, who are playing video games, who are scrolling to the next video. And along with that loss of man, we have begun to lose much of what maintained American infrastructure. I got into this debate this week with a former colleague and friend of mine at ESPN, Emmanuel Acho, who's now here at Fox Sports. I tweeted out a report from CNN.com where they talked about the medical profession. And they mentioned the disparity in racial makeup among doctors. The CNN report in their tweet says only about 6% of doctors in the U.S. are black or African American, about half of the percentage of patients. Experts warn that's hurting public health. I find this incredibly concerning. First, I think that in this report, there are so many problems that one should dismiss it almost out of hand. What experts? Bobby Burke at Outkick said at that point, the report is immediately dismissible. Randomly quoting experts saying this could lead to a rise in public health crisis immediately begs the question, what experts? What are you talking about? But that's not the only problem I have. In the same report, they point out that 6% of doctors are black, while 13% of the population is black. They hand wave their fact. They wave their hand at the fact that 6% of doctors are also Latino, but 18% of the population is Latino. They don't spend much time worrying about the racial gap of doctors when it comes to Latino. And it seems to be that way in our modern social justice movement. It offers very little for Latinos, which to me shows the inherent charade in the pursuit of diversity, which then begs the question, what is diversity? We've talked about this. Please define diversity, because increasingly what becomes clear is the word diversity is simply a Trojan horse for the word black. They don't mean we need more Latinos. They don't mean, in this case, we need more women. What they mean specifically is we need more doctors to be black. To me, then, that leads to one more question. Well, what would be the appropriate percentage? What percentage would represent justice? I've always asked this. In sports, when they point out how many coaches in the NFL are black, I want to ask, well, at what point, at what percentage would you say you've arrived at a threshold that reflects justice? 70% of the players are black. Does that mean 70% of the coaches should be black? Is that justice? If there's only one black director at the Oscars nominated for an Academy Award, is that injustice? I believe what is the Oscars up to? 10 nominees? Is it 12 nominees? Is it 8 nominees? I've lost track and lost interest in the Oscars. But same question, what would represent justice? Is it 13% of the nominated directors being black? Of the nominated actors? Of the nominated actresses? Is it reflective of the population? I don't know what percentage represents justice. And then I think the ultimate tell in the charade is inevitably when we point out racial disparities, and I mean this, inevitably, the solution eventually gets to lower standards in order to elevate. It's either lower standards in order to elevate more minorities into the relevant pool, the relevant population, in this case, doctors, or it is to place more stringent standards on those of the disapproved race, in that case, white doctors, make it harder for white people to become doctors. In either case, lowering the standard of medical care. Here, let me try to explain what I mean about lowering that standard. In moving towards a race-conscious policy. There was a group this week, there was a report on FoxNews.com that there's a group who has unveiled that the Biden administration is encouraging the IRS to address racial disparities in audits. They're encouraging every federal agency to look at DEI policies, including taking a look at algorithmic policies that lead to racial disparities. Algorithmic policies. So right now, we presume, although we shouldn't presume, we should remain skeptical, that the IRS has a set of standards that would be race neutral in how they establish who will be audited. Systemic injustice, true systemic injustice in the United States of America was done away with in the 1960s with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That did away with race-conscious policies in the United States. Now, the argument is made by social justice warriors that systemic injustice is now embodied between the lines, that it can't be seen in a code, only determined in application by witnessing racial disparities. But the code of federal law is race neutral, meaning any type of IRS auditing policies would have to be on their face race neutral. Now, it doesn't play out that way, just like everything in life doesn't play out evenly on racial, gender, socioeconomic, height, weight, parameters. Nothing comes out equally. Nothing is equitable because we're all of different abilities and standards and behaviors. So what we find out is Black Americans are audited anywhere from, I believe, 2.9 to 4.7 times as much as other ethnic groups. Why that may be, there's a whole host of factors that could go into why that may be. But in modern day America, we can only presume that it is because of systemic racism. Now, let me ask you, how are they going to address that? My suspicion is with the hiring of 88,000 new IRS agents, they're not going to address it by reducing the number of audits on Black Americans. What they're going to do with those new 88,000 IRS agents is increase the number of audits on white or Asian Americans. Now, how will they do that? Well, that's a great question. How will they adjust the algorithm? And how will they do it while remaining race neutral. They will, who knows, adjust the standards in some way that, in my estimation, probably will violate the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And as we've talked about on numerous occasions, we come full circle where America adopts a new neo-racist, segregationist outlook to social justice in the pursuit of equity. Just like we're talking about when it comes to doctors, you can make it harder for white people to become doctors or make it easier for black people to become doctors to establish the ratio you feel represents social justice. But what, in the end, exposes the charade is I don't think any American, no Latino, no black person, no white person, cares to compromise the standards of their doctor when they're going and literally choosing their healthcare provider in a matter of life or death. No one, including the people on that CNN set, are going to make compromises because they're like, well, this guy graduated first in his class from Harvard. He happens to be a white guy. Shoot. Let's take the guy who didn't do as well because he's black. My friend Emmanuel Acho responded to that to me. He said he pointed to some statistics. He said to me, and he did eventually give me some citation because he didn't at first. He said to me, Will, empirical data states in the United States, black newborns die at 3 times the rate of white newborns, regardless of a mother's income or education. When black babies are birthed by black doctors, their infant mortality rate drops by 50%. For black women and black children, diversity is life or death. Now, what Emmanuel is suggesting here is that a black doctor has a better ability to hear, culturally understand, diagnose, and help a black patient than does a white doctor. And that results, he says, according to this study, in better infant mortality rates. It leads to some very interesting questions, one of which I asked him immediately. I said, Emmanuel, does that study show the same correlation for white patients and black doctors? Is there a higher mortality than if they had gone to a white doctor? Is the takeaway that white people should only see white doctors? Pretty interesting when it's reversed. Is it that we should readopt segregationist mentalities and only see people who reflect us, not just culturally, but racially, because they have a better ability to understand us? Or is a more enlightened society, and not just enlightened, to the point of this broader conversation, a better working society, one that says simply, hey, see the best doctor available? I think we all know the answer. And I think that's why no one would choose to compromise their doctor based upon racial standards. Just like in America, we should not compromise who's the transportation secretary, whether or not he's gay or straight. We should not compromise who runs our businesses, whether or not they're male or female. We should not compromise who maintains our infrastructure, whether or not they're white or black or trans. We should be in pursuit of the best. And for too long, I think, men have been told they are not the best. In fact, men have been told that their traits, their ambition, their competitiveness, their confrontation, their masculinity is the problem. And left in the wake is not an Atlas who shrugged, as in the novel of Ayn Rand, but an Atlas who slouched, who chose to play another game of Call of Duty, who chose to watch one more episode of Yellowstone. Men who plugged in and checked out. It's not just train derailments in East Palestine, Ohio, that have shown the hollowness of man. They've shown the lack of purpose left in modern America. And it's not just theory. It's not just an abstract conversation for you and me. It's showing up in our daily lives. It is train derailments. It is plane delays. It is compromised health care. It is landing the plane. There's a great article up on a Substack by Chris Bray where he said, we used to, land planes and stuff. He perfectly puts it into the lingo of the hollowed out American Gen Z male. He's talking about the way we converse, the hollowed out nature of our argument, of our thought process. There was a free speech symposium at, I believe, Yale University, where the free speech guest was shouted down by Yale law students, shouted down and cursed at by Yale law students. These are America's future lawyers, and judging by the complexion of the United States Supreme Court, possibly America's future justices of the United States Supreme Court. And their argument amounted to, shut the hell up. I don't want to hear your shit. At which point these students walk out on a symposium on free speech, go have a session of day drinking, just like they will in their Supreme Court argument. You guys are a bunch of assholes. I'm out of here. And then hit the bar, fully expecting the Supreme Court to come back and rule in their favor. Because, of course, absolutely, they can't even. Bray also talks about, we used to land planes and stuff. There's been a rise also, not just in airport delays and train derailments, there's been a rise in almost collisions in the air. If you guys saw the story just a few weeks ago, but it was in Austin, Texas. A Southwest Airlines flight and a FedEx cargo plane almost hit each other, taking off, one landing, one taking off, literally on top of each other, only because one of the pilots was absolutely sharp to see it, OODA looped it, observe, orient, decide, and act. OODA looped it ahead of time. Was he able to narrowly escape this midair collision? And there's been several pilots on places like YouTube and Substacks laying out the rise, which we don't hear about often, the rise in these midair collisions. Failures in yet another piece of our infrastructure. Air traffic controllers, pilots, airports. We are literally compromising our infrastructure. We're literally compromising our safety. We're literally compromising our health, and we're losing our ability to land planes and stuff because we have vilified men. We have hollowed out men. We have lost men. We have lost mankind in America because we have prioritized form over substance. We have all the muscles. Andrew Tate, who I think says a lot of smart things, but gives us a very shallow vision of what it is to be a man. Your kids know about Andrew Tate. Have as many chicks as you can get and drive fast cars. A hollow, shallow version, form over function of masculinity. We have all the trappings of wealth. I think it was another Chris Bray Substack that says, did you ever see the play or the movie or the book Grey Gardens about the old ladies that lived out on Long Island in the Hamptons who used to be wealthy and they still have everything? They have the furs, they have the china, but they literally don't pay their bills. They don't have running water. They don't have electricity, and their mansion is dilapidated. I think it's based upon a true story. That's America. Hollowed out, form over function, style over substance. All the trappings of a society that one day, not long ago, was wealthy, but now has no ability to make things work, to land planes and stuff, because we lost the men that know how to do that. Atlas slouched. He's playing Call of Duty. Would have been much more noble had he shrugged. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.